Today I'm meeting Ken Shingleton, former operations officer for the Weston Region, to discuss the many train stations that were once in Swansea. Thank you so much for speaking with me today, Ken. So you were operations officer for the Western Region. Can you tell me a little bit more about what that job entailed?
Sure. Well, the operating officer for the region really was responsible, I suppose, first of all for safety. So I used to hold inquiries into accidents and derailments and things like that, which were quite fascinating, sometimes quite gut-wrenching as you can imagine. But also responsible for the operation of the railway, the fact that trains came along when they're supposed to do, the reliability of the trains, the availability. And then everybody would say trains are always late, which is not true. 90-ish% are normally on time, so we're responsible for the performance of the trains as well. But there were spin-offs of things like being the appeals officer for the disciplinary process if people were disciplined or sacked or whatever. So it was a fascinating job at the end of my career.
Why did you come to Swansea? Of all places, Ken?
Of all places, yes. I'd hardly ever been to Wales before I came to Swansea. But the first 10 years of my career were in engineering. I don't think I was ever a good engineer, but toward the end of the 10 years, I was appointed as an instructor in what were then new diesel-electric locomotives. And I came to Swansea to Landor Depot, opened and operated a classroom there to teach drivers mostly, but some apprentices as well, in the West Wales, from Fishguard, where in those days we even had drivers, from Fishguard through Carmarthen, Llanelli, Swansea, up to Margam, Neath and Margam. And I was there for about 3 years. They were very good to me. They were nearly all older than me, my students. They found me digs, they generally looked after me. And of course I met my wife running up and down Neath Road. So that's what I was doing here.
Why were there so many train stations in Swansea during the 19th and 20th century?
Well, Swansea, as people will know, has an amazing history of over 1,000 years as a settlement at the mouth of the river. But also it was strategically placed with coal and limestone and access to the ships and the ore deposits in the West Country for smelting and refining metals. And the Swansea Valley became very, very important. And of course then coal in itself became vitally important. I mean, South Wales was one of the principal producers and exporters of coal. And then after metal smelting, zinc, copper and so forth, iron and steel making all around Swansea, specialist steel, all the way around Gowerton, Gorsinan, all the way Port Talbot, and of course now really just at Port Talbot and at Trostre down to Llanelli. So all of this was of tremendous interest to railway companies. So this industry was of great interest for all sorts of railway companies. Amazingly, the London and North Western, which was based at Euston, and the Midland Railway, which was based in Derby. They were all ambitious, they were all in competition with one another, and they all wanted access to Swansea Bay. Not just Swansea, but to Neath and Port Talbot. And of course the same sort of thing was happening in Cardiff and Newport as well, and indeed further west in Llanelli. And then what I should say is, and then when the railway was there, people wanted to travel on it. So just like the Liverpool and Manchester, which was the first intercity railway in 1830, they didn't realise that there'd be a passenger boom. So there was a passenger boom in South Wales.
What were the 5 companies involved in serving Swansea, if you can remember them?
Well, actually, I think subject to correction from people here would be interesting to hear. But obviously people think of the Great Western, Brunel and the Great Western, and of course still very much there, High Street, the only passenger station in Swansea now. Brunel's Great Western ran from the main line at Swindon through Gloucester and Chepstow and along the South Wales coast, and it terminated first of all at Neyland. And Swansea was on a branch line. Brunel crossed the Towie on the viaduct, which you can see today, and then climb very steeply to Cocket Tunnel and steeply down to the estuary and Llanelli. So the Great Western is still there and was perhaps thought to be predominant. But I think if we could explore the freight situation in the early part of the turn of the century perhaps, we'd find that the London and North Western, which came down from right across Wales, the Central Wales line as we used to describe it, down the Clyne Valley, along Swansea Bay, which is now cycle and footpath, along the coast, and terminated at Victoria. They had extensive freight facilities, in which is now council, most of it council land, major locomotive depot. So that's Victoria. And then the Midland, which was based in Derby, they wanted to get to Swansea, and that was difficult because they had to forge agreement with other companies to do it. But eventually the Midland arrived with their own station in St Thomas, remnants of which can still be seen. They had big warehouses in the docks. I think the Waterfront Museum, the older part of it, was part of that, but that's subject to correction. They had a locomotive depot out at Upper Bank, which is now a housing estate, and they were very, very, very busy in the freight scene, but they ran passenger trains, ultimately, as far as Birmingham, via Brecon and Hereford and Worcester. And indeed, you could go to Birmingham several ways from Swansea. You could go on the Great Western via Cheltenham and Stratford-on-Avon. You could go from Victoria via Shrewsbury and Wellington. You could go from St Thomas, as I just said, via Hereford. It's extraordinary, the competitive situation. And then along the coast came the Vale and Neath, which as its name suggests, but it came from Merthyr, Aberdare, down the steep incline from Hirwaun to Glynneath, and then along the coast beyond where Amazon is now. And they had a passenger station at the bottom of Wine Street, which I've not been able to find out where it was, and nobody seems to know. It'd be lovely to find out if somebody knew exactly where that was. And interestingly enough, that was closed in 1871 due to congestion in Wine Street. So nothing changes. And then their replacement passenger station was East Dock, and there are still elements of that. So then there was the Rhondda and Swansea Bay, which, as the name suggests, came from the Rhondda, Treherbert and Blind Rhondda, through the Rhondda Tunnel, which is now being converted into a cycle and footway, one of the longest in Europe, I'm told, and then down the Avon Valley, through Port Talbot, along the coast at Briton Ferry, and parallel then across the river, Neath, and paralleled with the Vale and Neath. They had their own station in what is now SA1.
Where were the passenger stations for all these companies?
It was High Street, Victoria and St Thomas, the principal ones, and then in East Dock was the Vale and Neath and the Rhondda and Swansea Bay, and of course the Mumbles train in Rutland Street by Victoria.
Before I finish, Ken, is there anything else you'd like to say now that you feel you haven't already said about the Swansea Railways that you think viewers at home may like to know about?
Well, I'm always interested to learn more, but there are two things that it's too late now, I'm too old, and the history's moved on too far. But two of these lines we've mentioned, first of all from Pontedelos, Gorsine and Gowerton, Killay, Dunvant Killay, down the Clyne Valley, along the coast of Victoria, where LC2 is now. That would have been a fantastic commuter line to and from Swansea. And at each place there would have been sufficient room for car parking where the goods yards were. When freight was transferred, almost all of it local freight to road, there would have been space for car parking. And the other one, rather similar, down the Swansea Valley from places like Ystlyfair and Ostragonais, Pontardawy, Clydach, Morriston. If somebody had forethought 40, 50 years ago, that would have been a wonderful commuter route into the centre of Swansea. But all of that's gone on. History's overtaken us with all of that. It's a great shame, in my view.
Thank you so much for your time today, Ken.
Oh,
I really
thanks,
appreciate it. Thank you. It's hard to imagine Swansea today with all of those railway stations, but I guess it just reminds us of how industry-heavy Swansea and indeed Wales once was. which explains the demand for train services back then. Thank you to Ken for his time and for giving me an insight into how Swansea's railway network once looked. Thank you for watching.